of the spring, going to take us through Easter and beyond. It's entitled Power and Weakness. I'm a little bit hot, Charlie. Just pull me down just a little bit. I'm going to blow you out here in a second. And if you remember in 2 Corinthians, every week we've been watching Paul work really hard to get this church in Corinth back on track. And so he's been working to get them back on track in action, and he's been working to get them back on track with their giving. He's been working also to get them back on track with their doctrine, okay, with what they believe. A new group of believers came into town after Paul had thrown the church into, let me kind of get this straight. A new group of leaders came into town after Paul, and they had thrown the church into kind of an uproar, into an attempt to gain control and grab authority. And these leaders had really kind of engaged in a smear campaign against Paul. And it was this constant stream of criticism. Paul was annoyed about this, for sure. But what was even more concerning for Paul was that these false leaders had really made Paul the argument against the gospel. All right? And if you think about it, they're saying basically, Paul's teachings can't be right. Paul's teachings about the gospel can't be right. I mean, look at him. Look at him. He's weak. He's sick. He's poor. He's beat up. He's unattractive. How can what he says be right? So Paul had been kind of made into the argument, and there were some people in Corinth that were buying it. And Paul really had to kind of do two things in response. He had to defend himself, defend his authority, and then also address the wrong thinking that caused the problems to start with. And he's been unwinding this all the way. And so that's kind of where we are now in chapter 10. And this really goes all the way to chapter 13. But today we're going to look really into chapter 10. And what you're going to see in chapter 10 is Paul's strategy for addressing these issues with Corinth, with the Corinthian church, and then focusing on one of the really more sticky barriers that the Corinthians were dealing with. And it's really one that all of us, in one way or another, continue to deal with. So there's lots to get to here. So we're going to dive right in. This is going to be 2 Corinthians 10. We're going to start in verses 1, move through verse 6. He says this. It says, "By the humility and gentleness of Christ, I appeal to you. I, Paul, who am timid when face to face with you, but bold I expect to be toward some people who think that we live by the standards of this world. For though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does. The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. And we will be ready to punish any act of disobedience once your obedience is complete." It's so telling to me that Paul's initial appeal to the Corinthians really was framed in the humility and gentleness of Christ. He says, hey, I'm not coming to fight you. He says, hey, it's me. It's Paul. And he kind of gets a little bit sarcastic here. He says, the guy that some of you criticize, saying that my letters are bold and I'm tough on my letter, and when I write it in person, I'm cowardly and weak. It kind of reminds me of the Wizard of Oz. Are there Wizard of Oz people here, Wizard of Oz fans? I gotta be honest, not a fan. Not a fan of the Wizard of Oz. I don't know if the monkeys scared me growing up. They did. I think those are very traumatic images to grow up with. But if you remember when Dorothy and Company first met the wizard, and fire and smoke and big green head booming out, I am the great and powerful Oz, and they're all like, all this kind of thing. But by the end of the movie, Toto pulls the curtain back, and you discover that this powerful wizard that was feared far and wide is really kind of actually a bumbling old man. That Paul's opponents had a similar image of Paul. They're saying, no, that's what Paul's like. Talks a big show when he's away, but when he comes to you, when he comes to your town, you find out he's just a weak old man. And And so Paul's saying, hey, I'm appealing with you in gentleness right now. And I know you think I'm weak in person, but when I come, you probably don't want to test that hypothesis. You probably don't want to do that. I'm going to deal with anyone who believes we operate just like everyone in the world does, without principles, or that I'm an opportunist, which was another criticism. I mean, it's just a Rolodex of smear campaigns. Paul does nothing right. And so here's part of the passage that I think is a little more rich for us. It's verse 3. It says, though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does. It says, if I have to come and have conflict with some people there, I'm not afraid to do it, but we don't fight our battles the way the world does. That's not how we do it. Folks, one of the greatest temptations that any of us are ever faced with when we're wrong, or when somebody is mean or does something cruel to us, is to retaliate with the exact same thing they've done to us, all right? And we kind of mutate the golden rule, and it becomes, do to others what they've done to you. That's what we're tempted to do. Paul had been the victim of this massive smear campaign, manipulation, coercion. He'd been denigrated and insulted, and some must have expected that Paul would kind of respond in kind. Hey, smear me, I'm going to smear you. And it just kind of deteriorates into kind of an insult contest. You ever seen those? Comedians or rappers are saying, hey, you talk about my mama, I'm going to talk about your mama. You're ugly, so you're so ugly, you're so ugly, and back and forth. Paul says, no. That's what we're tempted to do when somebody says something about us. We're tempted to give in to the impulse to strike back with the same thing because we can't stand to think that someone has the upper hand, that someone gets the upper hand on us. And I love Paul here, and I love the Message translation. It says, hey, we don't live or fight our battles that way. Never have and never will. Our weapons are not the weapons of the world, but they are power. And I love it. It says, they have divine power. They have God power to demolish strongholds. And Paul never really says exactly what those weapons were, but from references in the New Testament, in the Corinthian letters, and other places, we can kind of assume that he has in mind the truth of the gospel as seen in the cross. And we've seen all that demonstrated before in the book of Galatians. Remember we went through Galatians a couple years ago. Paul in that letter wrote about a time when Peter, the Peter, was in Antioch at the church there, and he would eat and speak with the Gentile Christians there at the church. But when influential Jewish Christians came and visited at the church, all of a sudden, Peter's sitting at a different table. Peter's sitting at the table with all the Jewish Christian cool kids, and not really saying anything to the Gentile Christians. And also all the Jewish Christians were kind of over here in their little cadre, and they didn't eat with the rest of the church. They didn't speak with the other part of the church. And when Paul saw this, he confronted Peter. So what did he do? Slap him? No. Did he insult his mama? No. Did he talk about how ugly he was? No. Paul told Peter that his behavior was out of line with the gospel. So Peter, this is all I need to tell you. What you're doing is not in line with the gospel. And so what's the gospel? The gospel is a demonstration of God's love for everyone, regardless of their race, regardless of their nationality. The gospel shows that Jesus has broken down those barriers. Paul says, those are the weapons that I fight with. Paul's going to talk about other spiritual weapons in other places like the armor of God and prayer and those things. And Paul will even suggest later in this book that in God's hands, even his weakness becomes a mighty weapon through which God works. Amazing. He says, those weapons, he says, demolish strongholds, demolish arguments, demolish pretension. And pretension is kind of like a self-deluded claim. Every self-delusional claim about ourselves that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. Because the reality is that Satan, the tempter, is really effective at constructing places in our mind and thinking that run contrary to God's wishes for God's people. Satan's like a builder in the video game Fortnite. Any Fortnite players here? Anybody heard of Fortnite? Some of you have. If you haven't asked your grandkids about it, they will tell you. All right? So Fortnite is kind of a battle game, and they put 100 people into this kind of land area, and you just kind of fight it out until the last one standing. All right? And one of the abilities your player has in that game is not just to go get other people, but you can also build structures. You know, you can put up walls and then a floor, walls, floor, walls, floor, and kind of build you a little fort. Well, eventually, the game had to do something about people building strongholds and structures because people became so skilled at doing it so quickly that, every time somebody would shoot it, you'd get, one bullet on somebody, and then all of a sudden, and this big stronghold would go up. And it was funny because it was just a matter of seconds, and if there were two people doing it, it was kind of funny to watch because they'd take one shot at each other, boom, and up these. It didn't make that sound effect, but it probably should. and up they go. And folks, it's the same with us, because one of the things I've discovered is all the enemy needs is a little bit of space. That's right. And a little bit of time. Before we know it, there's a stronghold of thought that's moving us in wrong directions. And that's serious. You know, strongholds are a problem. But you know what? Everyone in the ancient world knew, however, that in the long run, the advantage was always with the side of the attacker, not with the person building strongholds, not with the fortress. No matter how well defended cities might be, they would eventually fall to a smart, resourceful, and patient general. Some of you have been around Masada, been to that area. You know, this fortress on a plateau, impregnable, until the Romans just took months and built a big old ramp all the way up to the top. And Masada, eventually fell. It says human bulwarks in thinking, folks, no matter how high, no matter how lifted up, can never ultimately withstand God's power. It's the power of the gospel. Paul's prepared to kind of fight a pitched battle to liberate the Corinthians' thinking. He says, we're going to go through the gospel again, and we're going to look at it, because that's where the problem is. It's in your thinking, and it reminds me of this scene from a film, A Beautiful Mind, and some of you have seen that before, about Robert Nash, who was this gifted mathematician, just thought on a totally other level, but also struggled with very profound schizophrenia. So he really struggled with, trying to discern what was real in his mind, and he was trying to handle this all himself, and he was trying to kind of think all this out, and he finally had a friend confront him about his handling of the situation. He said, you can't reason your way out of this, John. And John Nash just snaps back up. Why not? Why can't I? And his friend responded, because your mind is where the problem is in the first place. There are times, Paul says, there are strongholds in your minds, Corinthians, that are keeping you from seeing the truth. And I'm going to use what God gave me to clear those strongholds out, to take hold of every thought, because their thoughts needed to come under the lordship of Jesus Christ in order to be liberated. And what's true of the Corinthians, folks, is no less true of us. Is no less true of our minds. There are places, there are strongholds of how we think that need to come under the lordship of Christ. And we find the freedom in the gospel because the gospel breaks down those barriers. The gospel breaks down barriers of racism. The gospel breaks down barriers of self-hate or self-loathing. The gospel breaks down barriers of pride. He says, that's what I'm going to use to break down the barriers to help you start seeing what you need to see. And with that established, Paul went on to identify one of the main spiritual battles, barriers that had to be dealt with, that had to be torn down. And it's one we don't think of with much seriousness, and it can really be devastating. And Paul says you need to recognize, Corinth, what's going on. You need to recognize where you're getting off the rails. He said, and this is the biggie. And we're going to see it in chapter 10, starting in verse 7. We'll have this up on the screen as well. Paul says this, you are judging by appearances. If anyone is confident that they belong in Christ, they should consider again that we belong to Christ just as much as they do. So even if I boast somewhat freely about the authority the Lord gave us for building you up rather than tearing you down, I'm not going to be ashamed of it. I don't want to seem to be trying to frighten you with my letters. For some say, so here's that argument again. His letters are weighty and forceful, but in person he is unimpressive, and his speaking amounts to nothing. Such people should realize that what we are in our letters when we are absent, we will be in our actions when we are present. He's saying, let's not test the hypothesis, guys. You don't want to do that. It says, we do not dare classify or compare ourselves with some who commend themselves. When they measure themselves by themselves, compare themselves with themselves, they are not wise. We, however, will not boast beyond proper limits, but will confine our boasting to the sphere of service God himself has assigned to us, a sphere that also includes you. We're not going too far in our boasting, as would be the case if we had not come to you. For we did get as far as you with the gospel of Christ. Neither do we go beyond our limits by boasting of work done by others. Our hope is that as your faith continues to grow, our sphere of activity among you will greatly expand so that we can preach the gospel in the regions beyond you. For we do not want to boast about work already done in someone else's territory. Verse 17, but let the one who boasts, boast in the Lord. For it is not the one who commends himself who is approved, but the one whom the Lord commends. And folks, you don't really need any translation from me to understand what the big problem is in Corinth, right? So it's the first sentence of verse 7. 5 words. You are judging by appearances. That's the problem. You are making decisions solely based on what you see on the outside. And folks, throughout the Bible, this has always been a problem. And this has always been a dynamic about which God has consistently told his people to beware. In the Old Testament, there's the story where God sent the prophet Samuel to anoint a new king from one of Jesse's 7 sons. Remember that story? So they're all of Jesse's sons are going to parade by, and Samuel's going to be kind of looking and just seeing who's going to be the next king. And so when Jesse's oldest son, Eliab, who was the first, who was the biggest, the tallest, the strongest, the most handsome, the oldest in the family, kind of like, myself and things, you're oldest in the family, the biggest, the strongest, we don't come striding by, I'm the oldest child. In that culture, that was the preference spot. That was the place of honor among the kids. And so, here comes Eliab walking by, and Samuel says, well, there he is. There's the next king. And God comes to him and says, nope. And you get this great verse, 1 Samuel 16:7 says, but the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. And then here's the takeaway. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. The son that God said had Samuel ordained wasn't the first one, or the second, third, fourth, fifth, or sixth. It was the youngest. Right? He's known, I've used that Hebrew word for the hackathon, which is kind of the runt, the unimpressive. Do you have any more kids? He wasn't even brought to, we have the runt here, David, listen to him. And he's the one that was chosen. The youngest, the smallest, most significant of all the brothers, the one no human would have ever chosen, was chosen. God commended things about David that had nothing to do with his appearance or his status. And Paul's basically telling the Corinthians, you're making the same mistake Samuel did. And there's a real danger, folks, when outward appearances become our main focus. And there's 3 of them. You can see all 3 of them here. The first is this. When you focus on appearance, it leads to division and judgment. You know why? Because you're always comparing. You're always comparing. Am I as attractive as them? Am I as wealthy as them? Is my stuff as good as theirs? Are we doing as well as them? Are we, do I have as many friends as they do? Do I have as many likes as they do? Do I have as many, on and on and on? And what success in all of that, is you don't look like this, if I don't have it, then you're not part of us, and it all comes on, that comparing type thing, and you can see it here in the second part of verse 7. Paul says, hey, if any of y'all think you're the only ones that belong to Christ, because of how you look, or because of how much money you got, or how much, all of this, you need to think again. Because we belong to Christ just as much as you do. Us weak people, us poor people, we belong to Christ. They say, Paul, you're not as good a speaker as these guys are. You're not getting it done like these guys are. We need more proof that really God speaks to you. And Paul thought that was ridiculous. Because he's saying, hey, we started this church, and most of y'all came to Christianity in the first place through our preaching, our work among you. If anyone doubts that God is with me because of my appearance, explain again how you all are here. Explain again how you all came about. There's just division going on when you start, just judging things from the outside. The second is this: judging by appearance leads to prideful self-elevation. And here's another place where you need to discern a little sarcasm from Paul. Because Paul says, hey, we wouldn't dare want to classify ourselves with these other guys who measure their success by themselves, who compare themselves with themselves. Hey, that's not wise. We wouldn't dare compare ourselves to people who look in the mirror and decide if they're pretty hot stuff. And haven't we all kind of been there at times, and we're growing up, you're looking in the mirror and or mess with the hair and those kind of things. And sometimes it's the opposite way. We look in the mirror and we're like, no. But these guys were looking at the spiritual mirror of themselves and thinking, hey, we speak well, we know all about the scriptures, we're in demand, we are wealthy, people are responding, look at all we've done, we're doing it right, we're doing it better than any minister you've ever had. And folks, all of that boasting is just a function of pride. That's all that it is here. He says when you're on, and Paul says that's foolish. When you're on that way, you find yourselves having to put other people down in order to make yourself look better, which is what's going on with Paul. And then he says you have to take credit for the work of others to make yourself feel important. Remember Paul saying that? Hey, we don't take credit for work that other people have been doing. We don't come into some other church or some other region and take credit for, the work that other ministers and that other folks and that other, things have been doing. And you see both of those things happening. So you get stuck in this feedback loop of always having to prop yourself up, of always having to toot your own horn. And you've seen it. You've experienced it. That is another piece of this, of judging by appearances, that just becomes, exhausting. And the last thing about judging by appearances is this: it produces leaders that are selected by human commendation or human eyes rather than God commendation. And really, that's the crux of what Paul's getting at with the Corinthians. He says your preoccupation with appearances has led you to follow leaders who look good, but inside are spiritually empty. Inside are going the wrong direction, and you struggle to see it because the outside is so attractive. Recently there was a podcast about a church in the northwestern part of the country that grew to thousands of members over a couple of years, and then in the scope of a few months just collapsed. It just collapsed down to nothing. And they were trying to kind of dissect what happened, and they were talking with somebody that had been kind of on the understaff. They were interviewing him. And one of the things that they identified was that the more the lead pastor became successful, the more the lead pastor became a known commodity, there began to develop a culture where he was hard on the staff, where performance was valued over spiritual growth, where dissenting voices were dismissed, and where finally he wrote some books that were kind of doctrinally a little questionable. And the interviewer asked, he said, hey, why was all of this tolerated? Why was all this tolerated by the church? And it was amazing what he said, and his answer was, because we were having so much success. Because it was looking so good from the outside. And they'd talk to people and they'd say, hey, the pastor would say, why are you getting on my case? Look at how we're growing. Why are you getting on to me? On the outside things looked great, but we were rotting on the inside. And And you can see some of those leadership problems happening in the church in Corinth. Paul says, we'll do some boasting, but our boasting is going to be limited to a couple of things. One, we'll boast about the work we've done in the sphere where God has assigned us. He says, I'm not ashamed to talk about the work I've done with you. He says, we're not going to take credit for the work other people did. And we always want to go someplace where there isn't any work so that we don't step on the work that other people are doing. And then finally, he says this, our boasts are ultimately, finally, about what God is doing. Not about what we're doing. He says, let the one who boasts, boast in the Lord. And that's so important to remember, guys. I said, we want to work hard as a church. I want, to be prepared and to teach and to counsel and pray with people. And that's what we want to do, to minister to our community. But folks, any life transformation that happens here, any growth that takes place, any needs that are met, any people that are helped, anyone that comes to the gospel, all of that is due wholly and completely to the work of God. It's not about anything that I do or that anybody else does. It's about what God wants to do through what's happening here. Focusing on appearance withers when you remember, just as what Paul said in verse 18, that what ultimately matters is not what you say about yourself, good or bad, for that matter. What matters is what God says about you. Folks, the whole world may look at you and say, you don't know enough, you're not smart enough, you're not strong enough, you're not attractive enough. None of those things matter when God says to you, in me, you are more than enough. More than enough. Strong words from Paul. There's a lot to think about here. Perhaps today there are some strongholds in your mind, and you realize they are holding you back from what God has for you. Today is the day to let the power of the gospel wash over your life and break those barriers down. Folks, like I said, the gospel can destroy barriers of prejudice, of unforgiveness, of fear, of discouragement, of lack of generosity, of lack of empathy, of lack of loving yourself. Paul says that the gospel has the ability to knock all those things down, to move them out. You can't just reason them out. You can't just say, well, I'm going to think through this and I'm going to get it figured out. Paul said you can't do that, just like because your mind's where the problem is in the first place. He says all those thoughts need to be brought into lordship under Jesus Christ. Father, and we talk about it all the time, that Jesus is the only king who has the true authority to be the sovereign over my life. There's no other king that has the ability to say, you have to listen to what I say. The only person that can make that claim on followers of Jesus is Jesus. So I'm the only one. And so every thought needs to come into that spot where, hey, Jesus, what do you want me to be? What do you want me to do? There are times that you have to spend moments focused on the message of the gospel and let that truth push out all the messages that we receive that aren't honest. And perhaps the barrier that you need to deal with most today is that of appearances, because it's affected how you view others and how you view yourself. Are you spending time and energy trying to maintain the appearance that everything's great, that everything's wonderful, while inside there is some profound spiritual work that needs to be done? Maybe you're battling with your own pride, giving yourself too much credit. We can do that even as a church. Perhaps it's time instead to let your life point to a good and powerful God, to let your boast not be about anything great that you do in your own power, but just how great that God is that works through all of this in all of my life. It's a struggle, and it's a battle. But Paul knew that with the power of the gospel, it's a battle that could be won, both for the Corinthians and for us. Let's pray. Father, I thank you so much that when we talk and look in this passage about the Corinthian church, it's not just a passage about Paul and the Corinthians, it's a passage that speaks to us. It's a passage where your Spirit can come in and move and speak to us about things that are going on in our lives. And so, Father, as we've listened to your word, we just ask that you would speak. That you would come in and speak to us in the places in our hearts. And that you would address the barriers in our lives, the barriers in our thinking that need to be brought down with the power of the gospel. We ask this in Jesus' name. I'm going to ask you to stand up just for a brief moment. Perhaps as you've been thinking about this and kind of working this through in your mind and just thinking about what the scripture has been saying and listening to what I'm saying, maybe God has identified a place in your mind, a stronghold of thought that he says, hey, the gospel needs to confront that. You know, we're not people that confront just to confront or just to be contrary. But the gospel is confrontational. The gospel comes up against those places in our lives that we set up that are against the knowledge of God and says, hey, we need to tear that down. That's not leading you to any place that's going to bring you life. So maybe there's a place, maybe it's a place of unforgiveness where there's something happening. You've just never forgiven that person or never forgiven anyone for that event. And that twists us at times. The power of the gospel is that even when we were the most at war with Jesus, when humanity was placing Jesus on the cross, the words out of Jesus' mouth were asking God to forgive. And the scripture says over and over and over, we confess our sins. God is faithful to forgive us. And when we've been forgiven, that gives us the power to forgive others. Maybe that's just one example. Maybe that's the stronghold that's been built up that needs to come out, because that can be a pretty strong one. When we get wrong, that really built up something strong in our lives. Maybe someplace else. Maybe you have been resisting Jesus for a while, and you know that Jesus has been asking you to trust him, asking you to give your life to him, and you're just like, no, I just can't get over my fear. Maybe that's where the gospel needs to come in and say, stop being afraid. Maybe you look and say, man, pride, I've just been broken by my pride. It just takes me in all wrong places, and I'm so I'm so judged by appearances, and especially mine, and I never think I'm enough, or I'm always in competition. Maybe you need to hear God's voice tell you this morning that in Christ you are more than enough. And it's not anything about what anybody else has to say about you, or how attractive or wealthy or successful or the status that you have. It's about what God says about you right now. And what God says about you right now as a follower of his is that you are loved and that you are redeemed, and that he wants to walk and journey with you through all parts of your life. I came into this passage thinking, oh, there's not much here. I don't know. And then I got weighed down by so much that chapter 10 has for us. So I'm just going to give you a couple of seconds here to just kind of think about it and just open the door for the Spirit to come in and work in your life right now, wherever that place is. Father, in the stillness and in the silence, I love it when, I love for us to be loud and to sing and worship, but I also love it when it's quiet and when it's silent, because in the silence you sneak into places where we try to wall ourselves off. We sneak into those spots and say, hey, I want to address this. I want to talk about this. I want to have a conversation about how we can do this part of life differently. I want you to bring this part of life under my sovereignty. Let me guide you. Gosh, it's so hard to do. So hard sometimes to release control of our lives to you, and yet you promise that the power of the gospel is not to harm us, it's for our good, and it's for life, and it's for freedom. So let us find, Father, those places that we kind of move and allow you to work into our lives in this moment. So, Father, we just give all of that to you in this place. ask that you give us the strength to respond. We ask it in Jesus' name. We talk about this every week, and it's the same thing no matter what's going on. If you feel like God is working on something in your life right now, and you just want to talk to somebody about it, there'll be a couple of us up here after worship that we would be glad to talk with you, to pray with you about what's going on in the world, and just kind of help you discern what the next step is. Maybe you've never made that decision to become a follower of Jesus, and you'd kind of like to know more about that. That's a great question to ask, and we'd love to talk to you some more about that. In your worship guide, has kind of our activities going on for the weekend. You know what the big one is. Y'all are doing great about bringing in those eggs and getting them set up and getting them filled with candy. And so we are almost at the finish line. So thank you all so much. You know, it's always my kind of worry, and it's irrational worry that, you know, we're going to have like 7 eggs, you know, and for people to hunt. And you all always come through, and it's, you know, 6,000 or 7,000. And so it just blows my mind every time, your generosity. So thank you so much. So we've gotten the first part of it almost done. We get all the eggs are coming back. What we need next now is for, you know, to kind of help go put the eggs out and get it all set up on that Saturday morning, the 30th. We start, the hunt starts at 10:30. We get there about 9:30 and start setting things up and getting things ready. So I hope that you'll be there for part of that. Our Easter events are on there as well. So just remember, on Easter morning, we'll have a breakfast here in our fellowship area about 10:15, and we'll have all sorts of yummy good stuff there for you to eat, and then we will celebrate the resurrection at 11 o'clock. It's a spring break, so our students are not going to meet this week. We'll give them a week with their families, and a lot of them are out of town, and so we'll hit it back on March the 27th. The guys are going strong with their Bible study, and just if you're in town on Saturday mornings, that's a great place to be. We're kind of working through Tim Keller's Jonah study, and it's a lot of fun. So, hey, it has been great to worship with you this morning. As we go from this place today, go knowing that the power of the gospel is not something that is confined to the walls of this building. That when you step out into, you know, the wilderness, and that, you know, you got to fend for yourself. No. The promise of God is always the same. I will never leave you or forsake you. And the power of the gospel that breaks down barriers is walking with you into your tomorrow.